Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to our event with my very old and dear friend, Heraldo Muñoz. He is president of the Party for Democracy, and I would say the leader of the center left in Chile. He's had an amazing career. He was the Minister of Foreign Affairs from 2014 to 2018 in the second term of President Michelle Bachelet. He was the Assistant Secretary General of the UN. He was the Ambassador, Permanent Representative of Chile to the United Nations from 2003 to 2010. From my understanding, one of the longest serving, if not the longest serving ambassador to the United Nations in the history of the United Nations. So we are really pleased to have him today to give us his excellent and professional view of what's happening in Chile, not just in the country, but also, I'm sure we'll get his views about some other things and Chile's relationship with other countries in the hemisphere and outside of the hemisphere. This WebEx is off the record and not for attribution. And the program is part of our Southern Cone series and America's Society Council of the Americas initiative to address the challenges that this region faces post-COVID-19. We've muted everyone's audio and speaker. We ask that you keep your lines on mute to minimize any background noise. We will have plenty of time for questions, and at that point, I would ask you to let us know ASCOA programs, and we will call on you. And then please remember to unmute your connection. So with that, Heraldo, we are really looking forward to your comments today. Your leadership in Chile has really been over a long time and has really been outstanding. So with that, I pass the floor to you. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much, Susan, and thanks to all of the friends at America Society. I'm very pleased to be able to engage in this conversation about the situation in Chile and perhaps in the course of the dialogue to engage in issues relating to the foreign aspects of the Chilean situation, and perhaps a few comments on the region and the challenges that we face at the global level. But let me focus, Susan, to take advantage of the time and give my regards through you to many friends that I know from the America Societies for a long time. And since I cannot see them in presence physically, at least from afar, as it seems to be the norm these days. Let me begin by remembering a Chinese proverb, which goes like this: "May you live in interesting times." This Chinese proverb is based on the idea that, times of peace, times of normalcy are not very interesting because scientists don't engage in great research, and there are no great discoveries. Scholars and artists don't have great things to tell. And that actually then interesting times occur when the situation gets complicated. So clearly we're living in interesting times in Chile, perhaps too interesting to a lot of people's tastes, because we are not only living the pandemic, which is worldwide, but we are also undergoing a process, at least from October 18th, from the eruption of the protests and what followed, revealing, in my view, the fragility of Chile's development model, the inequalities, the abuse, the mistreatment prevailing in our country. Despite all of the advances in the past 30 years, and I am very proud of what we achieved throughout that period, evidently the deficiencies and the need for deep-seated reforms became evident after the protests, the wide protests, national protests of October 18th, in areas such as health, pensions, housing, further reform in education, indebtedness, decentralization, a host of areas where reforms, deeper reforms, were evidently needed, despite the fact that throughout the 30 years we were extremely successful in eliminating poverty that we inherited from the dictatorship, around 40% to about 8.2%, despite the fact that a lot of social sectors in society began to emerge into the lower middle classes, despite the increase in income in our country. Despite all of that and much more, income inequality and other inequalities remained. And not only income, perhaps in other areas even more marked in my view. And all of that erupted on the 18th of October, and I can go into that later down the road. And then on top of that, we were hit by the coronavirus pandemic. Clearly the worst crisis at the national level and the international level in 100 years. So that today the immediate challenge in Chile is the control of the pandemic, of the spread, of the deaths, and mitigating the socio-economic impacts of the effects of the virus. And in Chile, I mentioned it before, we have pending structural problems, and the pandemic made them painfully evident once again. In fact, the hardest hit districts or comunas in Chile with the pandemic have been the poorest ones. You can almost, you can see it in a list of the ones that have the highest contagion of the virus are the poorest, the lower income communes in the country, particularly the metropolitan region of Santiago. Now, our crisis has been aggravated by the poor management of the pandemic and erratic health policy. And this has cost us many lives, and in fact, has delayed economic recovery because the former Minister of Health refused to close malls or to close schools. And it was mayors that forced the government to do so. And he very early in April began talking about returning to a new normalcy and to a safe return to economic activity, whereby we could go out and have a beer or an empanada in public or have coffee, and began giving signals that made people then to think that it was okay to go out. And data show that was it was just the beginning of a huge increase in contagion. And moreover, the focus of the government was on the curative side of the pandemic instead of the preventive. Instead of doing a lot of testing, a lot of tracing of the contacts and isolation of people that had gotten the virus. So it was a a very erroneous policy that did not rely either on the primary health system in Chile, which is quite good compared to many other Latin American countries, at least. All of that cost us valuable time, and that's why we had to return to quarantine and to stricter measures, including more of the preventive rather than hospital-based policy. So all of that made it so that the perception of the institutions in Chile, which were already very critical. I mean, there's a fragility of institutions in Chile for many years now, became even more so. The lack of citizen trust in the public sector. And one could even perceive a problem of legitimacy. First, after October 18th, questioning the government and the president, and even though that went away with the pandemic, it returned as the pandemic began to deepen. And the situation then has become quite complex. And this in a context where people do not adhere to left versus right axis. In fact, the enormous majority of the people in Chile, and this is demonstrated by many polls, do not have party or political affiliations. In fact, higher than 80% and more, in fact, do not express any political affiliations. And in the middle, you have a particular situation of the middle classes, already showing signs of rage during the protests after the 18th of October, now suffering the consequences of the pandemic that threaten to push them back into poverty from which they had emerged. And this is something extremely delicate in my view. Despite all, and I want to put a positive tint on what I'm saying, despite all, we have been able to engage in dialogue and address our common challenges. In the face of social unrest and extremely difficult days that we lived after the protests of 18th of October, we were able to sit together, parties of the opposition, at least the majority, and the pro-government parties, and we agreed on the 15th of November in very early hours of the day on a document for a new constitution, agreement for a new constitution. And that agreement was endorsed by the government. And that allowed us to agree on a constitutional reform that enabled the conduction of a plebiscite to ask Chileans whether they want a new constitution or not, and whether the modality to do it will be the Constituent Assembly or a mixed modality. That plebiscite was going to be held on the 26th of April, and due to the pandemic, we had to postpone it for the 25th of October. So that's one major agreement that emerged under very difficult circumstances. In fact, the government hours before that was about to dictate a state of emergency, which would have perhaps made things a lot worse than they were. And in response to the disastrous effects of the pandemic, three opposition parties, in fact, there were four, but one of them withdrew. Three opposition parties, including my own party, sat down with the pro-government parties and the government, with the Minister of Finance, to discuss ways to alleviate the economic and social situation of the majority of Chileans, particularly vulnerable and middle class. And we agreed on a framework agreement on an emergency plan for income, emergency income, and reactivation of the economy, aside from a fiscal framework. As a consequence of that, resources were supposed to flow rapidly to the most vulnerable sectors and the middle classes. What we wanted from our side was a quick and robust transfer of resources to people that needed it, direct transfer of resources without bureaucracy. And this happened only late and in insufficient amounts. And I can go into that if people want details on this. And in parallel, since money wasn't arriving to where they should have arrived, and we felt that Chile had a space. Chile is one of the 3 least indebted countries in the OECD. So we could have engaged in more debt or use more our sovereign funds. We used some because this was an absolutely extraordinary situation that needed a transfer of funds directly to the people that needed it. And unfortunately, that did not occur. And in parallel, popular demand mounted for the simple withdrawal of 10% of mandatory savings in personal pension funds. And that is where we are right now. In fact, today, and probably a phone call I was getting was from somebody relating to this, because the lower house is voting on the withdrawal of the 10% of mandatory savings as an exception, and for only once due to the emergency situation, given the fact that the government has been unable to transfer directly funds to people that need it. Now, what is to be done then? And that is a major question, and very difficult to say, because we don't even know when we are going to get out of the quarantine. I'm speaking about the metropolitan region of Santiago. We're all under quarantine right now because the data of contagion is quite negative. Chile, in fact, is among the top 10 countries in contagion in the world by million of population. So that this is indeed quite risky to begin saying what should be done, but this would be my guess. First priority: control the pandemic. The relationship between the pandemic and economic recovery is absolutely fundamental to ascertain, to keep in mind. If we want to get back to economic activity, we have to control the pandemic, and we have to do more tests. We have to trace the contacts, and we have to isolate. That is all of the experience of the successful experiences show us. And that's what New Zealand did to get back. New Zealand closed its borders at the same time as Chile, the Southern Hemisphere, except that they did very strict quarantine, they did testing, they did tracing, and they did isolation. And people had enough money to put on the table without needing to go out to work. And now they're back to basically normal times, quote unquote. That's a priority. If we don't control the pandemic, I don't know when will be the horizon for return of economic activity. So the two things are absolutely linked together. Second, transfer of funds quickly to the most vulnerable and the middle classes. What you hear all around is people saying, I haven't received anything. Of all the bonuses announced, there's very few people that say, yes, I received. The majority of them say it's very bureaucratic, it's very high, it's very complicated to change the data from what I was doing, what was happening to me in March versus what is happening now in July. And you have to do it through internet, to the National Social Registry. And a lot of people don't have that ability. And that has been a major complication. So if there's no transfer of funds, and so far what the government has put on the table has not been sufficient, today in the morning, Joaquin Lavín, perhaps the main leader of the right, has said that the latest package is bad. It's not good. Leaves a lot of people out. And I agree with him, and I said it last night. So if that doesn't happen, then the withdrawal of the 10% of pension funds will occur. And we'll have to ensure that it's not regressive. And that will be linked to the larger issue of pension reform. Because yesterday the president said, presented the latest package for the middle class that has not basically been very well received. He said, I'm ready for structural reform of pension funds. Major surgery, he said, of the pension system. Well, that is a pending issue that we have to address. 3, ensure a safe plebiscite. We have to have the plebiscite on the 25th of October with health guarantees, with the best comparative experiences, so that we have that plebiscite that I think is absolutely fundamental, so that people can express themselves about whether they want or not a new constitution. Unless we have a sanitary debacle, I guess that we will have health conditions to conduct that plebiscite, and the government should ensure that. And 4th, I think we have to initiate the process on confronting all of these deferred challenges. And I proposed in the past a great economic and social pact. That is, whether we can imagine Chile not from here to the next couple of years, from here to 2030, beyond a government administration, so that the largest political arch could agree on what is the Chile that we want, what are the deep reforms that are needed, and how we're going to fund them through tax reform and through economic growth, because the two things will have to go together. No economic growth, no possibility of going ahead. No tax reform, no significant tax reform, it will be impossible to fund what we need. So in a sense, I think we have moved towards rethinking the model of development in Chile. For the first time in a long while, I hear business people speaking about the importance of the state. Before, a lot of people from an ideological spectrum wanted a small state, a weak state. Now, a lot of people say, no, we need a strong state to rescue companies, to go in the health, emergency health of sectors that are suffering. So we need a strong, active state. And the issue is not whether more or less state. The issue is whether you can have a model of development that goes towards something that became very controversial in recent times, but now has reemerged, a welfare state. the idea of guaranteed rights, as it is the case with many Scandinavian countries or with countries such as Australia or New Zealand. I think this is something that is beginning to happen in our country. And in fact, I'm not the only one saying that. Joaquin Lavín has begun speaking about that. Rodrigo Valdés, the former head of the central bank, has said, well, it is inevitable to have tax reform towards a welfare state if we want to look like New Zealand in the future. So that this is sort of the reflection in which we will have to engage as soon as we go out of this moment signed by the pandemic. The future is very uncertain, and we don't know whether the pandemic will cross itself with the protests and with the violence that we saw after the 18th of October. A lot will depend on how we get out of the pandemic. But I close by saying, I believe in Chile. I believe in our people, and we have gotten out of other catastrophic moments in the past, and I'm sure that we will get out of this one. So thank you, Susan.
Thank you, Heraldo, for your comments. They were really outstanding. I want to correct one thing I said, which is this is on the record, not off the record. I forgot that. And you said a lot of different things, and I want to pick up on two things. Number one, the welfare state idea with guaranteed rights. I guess in this country, we would call it what's the right social safety net. If you compare the US to Canada, or you compare yourself to New Zealand. And so if we put it in that context, I guess is that what you're thinking? And do you think that that's going to be the platform or one of the platforms of the center left? But it also sounds like it could be one of the platforms of the center right. So I guess the question is, how does this all come together? And how do you see, what is the biggest, within that context also, what is the biggest challenge to Chile's recovery?
Well, there are two major questions there, Susan. First, I think that it's almost inevitable that we have to march towards a welfare state or a country where rights are guaranteed, particularly basic fundamental rights, quality education, quality health, the right to housing, etc., and that the state would be at the service of the ensuring of those rights. And yes, it will be the platform of the center left, without a doubt. And you're right by saying it may be also the platform of the center right or the right, because I hear at least its major spokespersons speaking very similarly. I've spoken many times to Joaquin Lavín, and what he says, it sounds very much like what I'm saying. And in fact, we have had meetings. We had meetings throughout the protest. He wanted to hear what I thought. I wanted to hear what he did. And there's a lot of coincidences. But my feeling is that we have a more integral thinking about the level of development, which means that you need to have a strategy of development that is different from what we thought in the past and associated to a welfare state. It has to be a more integral. You have to emphasize innovation. You have to emphasize science and technology. You have to emphasize sustainable development, because if we learn anything from this pandemic, is a relationship between human beings and nature. If we haven't learned that, then we haven't learned anything. And so there has to be a major shift with that regard. So it's not merely, ensuring social rights. It's a lot more than that. A circular society, a society that invests a lot more in science and technology, in value added. Particularly in a country like Chile, we export almost half now of our exports are food related. Well, my perception is that the world won't accept foodstuffs that do not meet standards that will be a lot more demanding than before. So I think there will be a significant difference. And about reactivation, which you asked about. Well, my feeling is that first is the emergency. First, you have to transfer money directly to people that need it so that they can survive. That's the first priority. And there are some people that don't have enough to put, food on the table, and they have to do so. That is the first priority. Then the next priority will be soon, if we are able to go out in the streets, be able to go to work gradually. What we will need is to stimulate jobs. And that's what we agreed with the government. We agreed that there will be investment in job creation, and that there will be, and there has been already, a stimulus for the small and private and small and medium enterprises, and even the possibility of rescuing large companies of a systemic significance, not large companies, companies that are of a systemic significance. So all of that will be part of the next stage, and all of that in the context of doing anything we can to reignite economic growth, because that is going to happen, as we know, everywhere. I mean, the drop will be very strong, and in Chile we're thinking 8.5% drop in growth. Some people think that even more, but then that 2021 will be a recovery, even though we don't know, because with this pandemic, new waves of contagion make it a little bit uncertain. But clearly, recovery will, and policies aimed at stimulating jobs will be absolutely fundamental.
Thank you. A follow-on question to that, Heraldo, is about the pension funds. And so yesterday, as you mentioned, the president announced that he would like to do major pension reform. In your mind, what is that?
Well, at least I can tell you what I would like. I don't want this system, the pension system that we have today, but I don't want the sistema de reparto that we had in the past. What I advocate is a mixed social security system, but social security, I would have to underline, not just mandatory savings, because this is not even capitalization, it's mandatory savings, basically. And that would mean, if I had to talk about specific bills, referring to what the government introduced to Congress, and that is now in the Senate, and nothing has moved for several months because of the pandemic. I would say that a 6% minimum of additional points that would go to a public entity. As you know, only 10% is what is charged out of the workers in Chile. So it would have to go to 16%. Of that 6% would be managed by a public entity. One. Second, I think that there should be a difference between the gathering of the funds and the administration of the funds. And that I think is very, very important. And the Canadian example, I think, is very interesting in this regard. Three, there should be limit on commissions and on gains and profits by the pension funds. Fourth or fifth, there should be a package of gender equality, because women in Chile get much lower pensions than men simply because they live longer. And a lot of people say, well, this is, it's very clear, it's because there are, what is it called, lagoons, or there are portions of time where women do not put money into the pension funds. Yeah, because they're doing work that is not compensated. Like, for example, in Chilean families, and I think it may occur in a lot of countries, 99% of the care of elderly people that are prostrated are done by women. And oftentimes then those women leave the workforce to go and do this non-compensated job, and obviously then they need to be compensated by that. We have proposed a bonus to women that have to do those tasks. So there's a package that we need to discuss about gender equality. These are some of the issues that I think that we have to address. But if we don't have a very profound structural reform, there will be no support for the systems as is. It is very clear. I mean, and that's why the government has a problem, because members of UDI and Renovación Nacional, the pro-government party, have voted with the opposition for the withdrawal. So, and there's been extreme pressure in the last few hours, extreme pressures on the part of the government to change these votes. And some of them probably won't change. They will probably manage to change, the 3 votes that they needed. But that is an indication that this is widespread. This system doesn't have the adequate legitimacy, and it has to be changed in a significant way.
Thank you very much. I have a question from Catalina Ackerman from DirecTV. Catalina, unmute your phone and go on.
Hi, it's a pleasure. Thank you. I'm from Chile, so I understand everything that you are speaking, and I agree with almost everything. But my question is how to make the right-wing parties and the government to understand that there are minimum ethical benefits and rights that must be covered to get out of this crisis that began in October, and that will be, for sure, worse after the pandemic. Because this issue is, I think that is a key issue. How to make them understand beyond their own comfortable situation.
Well, I think, yes, I think it is a very fundamental question. And I recall the former Minister of Health saying, well, I just didn't realize how much poverty there was in Chile and how much people were living in small quarters, he says. I never realized how much. Then when you have a Minister of Health saying that, reveals that the elite in Chile lives in its own bubble and doesn't realize the level of inequality that exists in our country. And the inequality and abuse that is not just income. Income is one expression. And you can measure it in the Gini coefficient that has improved only very slowly in the past 20, 30 years. It has improved, but very, very small levels. But it's inequality of gender, because women in Chile earn 20% less than men. It's inequality in regions. You go to Santiago and the resources and the asymmetries are unbelievable. I have a friend who's the mayor of Arica, and he says, if I want to pave a street in my town, I have to ask the Minister of Public Works in Santiago, and if he doesn't give me an authorization, I can't do it. So it's also regional asymmetry. It is ethnic, because indigenous people in our society do not have the same access, the same rights that are for all the rest of the population. And it's even, there's a study by the UNDP saying that it even extends to our families, to where we live. It is different living in Lo Espejo, in Santiago, in the southern part of Santiago, where there are no banks, there are no public services, basically, than to live in Vitacura, which is amongst the most, the richest sectors of Santiago. And even the longevity measures are, as if we were in one case close to Africa and the other one's, perfectly in Europe. So I think it has to be an understanding of those differences. And the ethical component is absolutely fundamental. Now, on the other hand, there's responsibility, because not everything can be guided by moral outrage. And I feel that moral outrage, but I feel that we have to have responsibility for the whole country. And you have to balance out, economic growth with social justice. How do you do that? It's a question of leadership, and it's very difficult. Right? But there are some times where you have to balance on the side of the people, side of the majority, and that, I think, is the moment that we are living in Chile.
So, Heraldo, without saying I'm very critical of the government, many things that you said is very critical of the way President Piñera has handled the pandemic. What would you have done different, and what should they? You've talked about you need to get money into the hands of the people that need it. How should you do that, and how can that be accomplished?
Well, I told the Minister of Finance many times, because we spoke quite often, and I said to him, look, there's a great opportunity for the government, to come out on top of this, to have solved the pandemic and the social cost of the pandemic by putting out money, as other countries have done, that have spent 40% of their GDP, 50% of their GDP. You look at Spain, you look at Germany, even the United States. And I'm critical of the U.S. leadership.
I'm coming to that next.
Well, but even then, there were $1,200 deposited to practically all of the adult citizens in the United States. And I said to the Minister of Finance, this is what we have to do. Let's go with massive transfers so that everybody should stay at home. Otherwise, the quarantine won't work, because people, between respecting the quarantine and not having food on the table, they will go out to have food on the table. So they won't respect it. They will violate it. And when you look at the figures, Puente Alto, one of the communes, one of the districts in southern Santiago, the mobility rate there during the quarantine was almost 90%. In other words, 90% of the people were out in the street. Why? Because since it is a poor community, we're out looking for work. So my suggestion was, let's transfer a lot of money, go into debt, and let's use more of the sovereign funds, and let's transfer massively, and let's not do segmentation. Let's not focalize. This is no time to focalize. It's time to arrive with funds for everyone. Probably there will be people that didn't deserve it that will get that money. Okay, fine. It will be the sort of the minor costs of an emergency situation. But they didn't do that. They refused. They wanted to, they were very worried about, how the rankings are going to, what rankings will say about Chile. About saying, well, I had to save money for recovery, but we had enough money for recovery. In order to agree on $12 billion, it was quite hard to arrive at that. And I thought it was insufficient. But okay, that's what the framework, the fiscal framework that we agreed. $12 billion to be spent from here to the next 23 months, independently of the rearrangement of the budget, because that's out. I mean, that doesn't go into the formula. So what I would have done, I would have spent a lot of money. I would have transferred a lot of money so that people stayed at home. We would have controlled the pandemic. And the idea is that we would go back to work as soon as possible if we control the pandemic. But if we didn't spend the money, if we didn't arrive with money to the vulnerable sectors and the middle classes, it wasn't going to work. And what happened to the Minister of Finance is that in the end, he did the same, but piece by piece. He put some money at the beginning, then he had to increase his ante, he had to continue to increase it, and under pressure from its own sector, had to increase it even more. So it lost credibility because a lot of people felt, okay, if he continues to increase, maybe the government will be able to give even more, And that is really bad, because if you don't stand your position, you're in trouble in terms of trust before public opinion. So I feel that the government should have been stronger earlier.
Thank you. So I can't let time with you go by and not ask you foreign policy questions, because you're an expert in foreign policy. So I have a couple. Number one, let's start with just Chile's relationship with its neighbors and its leadership role within the hemisphere. How are you thinking about that today?
Well, as a former foreign minister, I'm always very cautious about this, because even though I have major differences with the present government, I adhere to a policy of state with regard to foreign relations. And I feel that with regard to neighbors, I think that we have conducted ties with neighbors with care. There are maybe some issues, but dialogue is always the main road. But everyone is worried right now about the pandemic.
Sure.
Under the period when I was a foreign minister with President Bachelet, we had a major issue with Bolivia. That issue was solved favorably for Chile. In fact, a historic diplomatic victory in the International Court of Justice that rejected the demand by Bolivia to gain sovereign access to the ocean under the thesis of obligation to negotiate. We demonstrated that there never existed an obligation to negotiate, and the court agreed with us fully. So that puts the relationship with Bolivia, I think, under a different perspective. With Argentina, there's a new government. There are some issues where we have to be careful, but we have to cooperate with Argentina and with Peru. But my preoccupation will be with a larger neighborhood where I have seldom seen the degree of disaggregation and the level of disparity in terms of political, ideological differences. And that makes it very difficult to do what we ought to be doing, which is more cooperation, more integration in the region. So it's a very difficult time for the region.
What about U.S. leadership? Because maybe some of this aggregation usually comes from.
Well, to be very frank, there is no U.S. leadership. That doesn't exist. The United States often was very justly criticized for leading in a negative way for Latin America, but at least it led. Sometimes it did it rightly, the least of the times. But today there's absolutely no leadership. I mean, there's no leadership by the present administration at the global level. I mean, I recall, the subprime crisis in 2008, 2009, when, the U.S. moved together with the other, the European countries and other powers to create the Group of 20 to solve that issue, because it was, evidently a common challenge. Here we have a larger common challenge, and the United States withdraws from the WHO. Before it has withdrawn from the Council on Human Rights. It has, rejected the Paris Climate Agreement, and so on and so forth. The list is too long. So where is the multilateral leadership of the United States? It's a pity what is going on. And the United States doesn't have a presence in the region, a political presence in the region. It seems that President Trump doesn't have much interest in the region at all. In fact, to just give you an example, I don't know how long is that Chile doesn't have an ambassador. And on the other hand, we have a Chinese ambassador that is extremely active, writes letters to the editor or newspapers. He appears on seminars. And there you have something interesting, because there's a vacuum created by the lack of interest of the United States in the region. Oftentimes, we said it's better that the U.S. is not interested in Latin America, so that we can we can move in an autonomous fashion. And okay, that is the choice of the United States. Chile, for example, has been spreading its interests worldwide, particularly regarding trade and investment, but the United States is totally absent in my view, with the exception of Mexico, and for obvious reasons, I don't see any presence in our region.
And as a last question, and just following up on that, you mentioned China. Do you think they're filling that void, both in terms of kind of ideology, but also real investment in the region?
Yeah, they've been coming with a great deal of investment, trade. You look at in any Latin American country, the main trade partner now is probably, in most of the case of Latin American countries, is China. It is in the case of Chile. So that is a major partner. Investment is less so, because Chile has, we don't do state-to-state agreements. And China is more used to that modality of investment. But they become accustomed that they have to compete, that we have public bids, and, whether you're from China, the United States, Britain, or India, you have to compete under the same conditions, and the best bid will win the concession. They've been learning that, and possibly then investments in Chile will increase on the part of China. Today, it is the United States, the main investor in Chile. So that, yeah, there is a void, and in my view, there's a sort of this larger issue between the United States and China, whereby, well, Chile won't opt. We've never opted for one country or another, and this is not something that we will do. We will, mind our own interests, and we will have the best relationship possible with the United States, and we will have the best relationship possible with China. But there is, this competition that I think has to do with an ascending power and a status quo power. And that there are many academics that have written about that. When that occurs, like in the case of Athens and Sparta, well, there was a war. But and 16 cases where there has been an ascending power, a rising power, and a status quo power, there has been war, but there have been some cases where it hasn't. There's been the minority. So that the great challenge for the future is how there is an understanding between these two powers that dominate the global scenario right now. And for Chile, of course, we will take advantage of everything China has to offer, but at the same time, staying at arm's length as regards our own interests. The same thing with the U.S. We are closer to the U.S. We're in the same hemisphere. We share more things with the U.S. But right now, under the present administration, I must say that the distance is enormous from my own perspective. I'm not speaking on behalf of the government.
Of course. So my one last question is, when do you expect the quarantine to be lifted in Chile?
Oh my God, that I really don't know. There has been an improvement, minor improvement in the numbers of the contagions in the last few days. That has led the health minister to lift and to authorize a very mild opening of two regions. Los Rios, that is the city of Valdivia, and Aysén, Coyhaique. The two of them began opening up restaurants in a very limited way and some economic activity. Santiago, which is more than 7 million people, we're stuck still in quarantine, and there's no saying when we will be out. The figures, the positivity is still very high. So long as the positivity or contagion is high, we can't. It has to drop to about 5% positivity to be able to think that we begin slowly opening up. So I hope the numbers have been improving. The positivity rate has been declining, but it's still very high, comparatively speaking to other countries. And the new health minister is putting a lot more effort into traceability to be able to trace, and he has hired hundreds of people to begin tracing contacts, and that is absolutely key. A lot of these contacts are absolutely lost, but if we can begin at least identifying who has been with whom that have been had suffered contagion, then there's a possibility that we will be able to tackle this sooner rather than later, I hope.
With that, our time is up. I want to thank you so much for your open, comments. They were incredibly interesting. You gave us perspective on so many different issues that are current in Chile today. I hope we can continue this dialogue because I think everyone appreciates your perspective. It's an important perspective in understanding where Chile is today and where and what people are thinking about in Chile and the direction of the country going forward. So with that, I want to thank you. I want to thank everybody that joined us, both on the WebEx, but also on the live stream. And I want to wish everyone safety, health and safety for you and your families. Again, thank you so much, Heraldo, and I wish you, your family, the very best.
Thank you very much, and continue to trust Chile and to bet on its future.
I will always trust Chile, and I will always bet on its future. And I think there's so many people in our audience today that feel exactly the same way. Thank you very much.
Yes, thank you very much.